Warning, this podcast contains descriptions of murder, torture and abuse. As a result, it may not be suitable for everybody. Sydney, Australia. Known as the Emerald City, with a population of over 5 million people. Famous for the Sydney Opera House and Harbour Bridge landmarks. Listen to the hometown murder cases of Anita Cobby, a murdered nurse and beauty pageant winner, and William McDonald, an English serial killer who killed 5, and lastly the Wanda Beach Killings. Thank you for the recommendation of Sydney, Australia as the first case we feature in Australia. Please reach out on social media at Hometown Murders. That's on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And if you've got your own hometown, or if you'd like to hear us record an episode on a hometown or city, please let us know. Thanks for everybody who shared and interacted with us and passed on the details. This podcast has allowed us to grow. Please carry on doing that. Thank you. So the first murder case we're looking at today for Hometown Murders is the murder of Anita Cobby. She was a 26-year-old Australian registered nurse and beauty pageant winner who was kidnapped while walking home from Blacktown railway station after dining out with 2 Sydney hospital colleagues in Surrey Hills, New South Wales, just before 10 p.m. on 2nd of February 1986. She was subsequently sexually assaulted and murdered. 2 days after being reported missing, Cobby's body was discovered on a rural farm in Prospect. Investigators led to the arrest of 5 men who were later convicted of her abduction, rape and murder on the 10th of June 1987, and each sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on the 16th of June 1987. At the time of the killing, Cobby sustained multiple knife wounds and lacerations from barbed wire. Her death was a result of a slit throat. The murder received widespread media coverage, condemnation and attention. Anita Lynch was born in Sydney on the 2nd of November 1959 to Gary Bernard Lynch, a graphic artist with the Royal Australian Air Force, and Grace Peggy Lynch, a nurse. As a teenager, she participated in beauty pageants, including winning the Miss West Suburbs pageant in November 1979, and had a promising career as a model. However, she decided to instead follow in her mother's footsteps and become a nurse. She met her future husband, John Cobby, while studying for a nursing degree at Sydney Hospital. They married on the 27th of March 1982. At the time of Cobby's murder in 1986, the couple had separated and Cobby was living with her parents in Blacktown, New South Wales. According to Cobby, he and Anita were on good terms when she was murdered and had been planning to reconcile. Cobby worked in Sydney and commuted daily from her home in Blacktown. On the day of the murder, she finished work at Sydney Hospital at 3 p.m. and met friends for dinner in nearby Redfern. Cobby then caught a train from Central Railway Station to Blacktown Station. Arriving at Blacktown, she would usually ring her father, who would pick her up. On the day of her death, she most likely decided to walk home after finding the phone to be out of order and no taxis available at the taxi rank. Aside from her killings, only 2 witnesses saw Cobby after she left the train station. Cobby was walking alone from the station along Newtown Road, Blacktown, around 10 p.m. when the gang of 5 men drove up beside her and stopped their stolen white HT Holden Kingswood. 2 men leapt out from the car and dragged her into the vehicle as she kicked and screamed. A 13-year-old boy, his younger sister and mother heard somebody screaming from their house directly opposite and had gone outside in time to see Cobby forced into the attacker's car. The boy ran across the road to help, but the car drove off before reaching it. Returning home, he telephoned the police to report what he'd seen. A few minutes later, after arriving home, their neighbour and his girlfriend, after being told of the abduction, drove off to search for the car. They eventually drove down Reen Road, now known as Peterbrook Drive, Prospect, and stopped by the now empty Holden, where the man used a spotlight to search the adjacent padlock. Seeing nothing in the paddock and believing the car he had been looking for a different model Holden, he returned home. The attackers later stated they had hidden in the long grass to avoid the spotlight and waited for the man to leave. Once inside the car on Newton Road, Cobby had been ordered to strip off her clothes but refused, begging her attackers to let her go and saying she was married and also menstruating. Her attackers punched Cobby repeatedly, breaking her nose and both cheekbones before forcing her to perform fellatio on all 5 men. The attackers then drove to a police service station to purchase fuel using money stolen from Cobby's purse. Cobby was then driven down Reen Road to this secluded paddock while being held down in the car, raped repeatedly and being continually beaten by the 5 attackers. They then dragged the brutally beaten Cobby into the paddock along a barbed wire fence where they dumped her and continued to sexually assault and physically abuse her for some time. According to his taped confessions, when the attackers, John Tavers, then became concerned that Cobby could identify them because she'd seen their faces and heard their names, and convinced the other attackers to kill her. Urged on by the others, Tavers slit her throat, almost severing her head. When Cobby did not return home, her family initially thought she had stayed overnight with a friend, but after learning that she failed to appear at work the next day, they reported her missing on the 3rd of February. On the morning of the 4th, her naked body was found in the paddock by a farmer investigating what his cows were merely milling around. Cobby's body was initially identified by her distinctive wedding ring, which was still on her finger when she was found. Her estranged husband, John, was initially suspected of her murder but was quickly cleared. The Australian public reacted with anger upon hearing the details of Cobby's murder. On the 6th of February, the New South Wales state government posted a $50,000 reward for information leading to the capture of Cobby's killer. Also on the 6th of February, morning radio host John Laws obtained a leaked copy of Cobby's autopsy report, which contained explicit details of her injuries, and read it live on air, both shocking and galvanising public sentiment. In the 2016 interview with 7 News, Laws said he did it because he felt the general public ought to know, and that incited anger in the public that murders like this were happening and we weren't being given the full details. On the 9th of February, police reenacted Cobby's movements on the night of her disappearance in the hope of jogging the memories of travellers or others who might have seen her. Constable Debbie Wallace wore similar clothing to Cobby and travelled the 9:12 p.m. train to Blacktown. Detectives interviewed the passengers and showed them photos of Cobby while Wallace walked the length of the train journey home. Following a tip-off from the police informant regarding the stolen Holden, police started searching for Tavers Michael Murdoch and brothers Les, Michael and Gary Murphy after they discovered that some of them had a history of violence and that Travers had a reputation for carrying a knife. On the 25th of February, police arrested Travers and Murdoch at the home of Travers' uncle and Les Murphy at the Travers home house. Murdoch and Murphy were charged with offences relating to stolen cars and released on police bail. Travers, who admitted that he'd stolen the car, made conflicting statements about the murder and was detained in police custody. While in custody, he requested a friend be called so he could bring him cigarettes. The phone number was handed to investigating police, who contacted the friend, a woman. The woman, Travers' aunt, eventually dubbed Miss X, agreed to help with the investigation, met with an officer and gave him details of Travers' background. Miss X was subsequently sent back in to talk to the Travers, agreeing to hide a recording microphone device while she visited him in his cell and was able to obtain a confession. Miss X later went to Murdoch's home while wearing the concealed recording device to capture his statements on tape as well. Eventually, 5 men were arrested and charged with murder. Police were praised with their quick response in capturing all suspects involved. In total, 22 days had elapsed from the time of the murder to the time that all suspects were taken into custody. 5 men were charged, who later all pleaded guilty or were convicted of the murder, had over 50 prior convictions from offences included armed robbery, assault, larceny, car theft, breaking and entering, drug use, escaping lawful custody and receiving goods, and rape. John Travers was considered the ringleader of the gang and raised in a property in Blacktown, the oldest of 8 children from unmarried teenage parents. By the age of 14, he was already an alcoholic, expelled from high school during year 10 for being continued disruptive to other students. He held few jobs and relied mostly on unemployment benefits. He eventually committed to the Boys Town, a juvenile detention facility, by his mother. His father, and never shared a close relationship, left the household in 1981. He found it difficult to support his family, and the Travers relied on crime to provide food, stealing animals such as chickens and ducks from nearby households. Michael Murdoch was a childhood friend and criminal association of Travers. He spent a great part of his childhood in juvenile prisons where he experienced sexual assaults. Michael, Gary and Les Murphy, 3 brothers from a family of 9 children. Michael was the eldest of the 9. He was sent to live with his grandmother when he was 12 years of age. Gary, aged 28, he had a hearing impairment and affected his schooling and left early to seek work. He was noticed as being able and willing worker before the crimes. His interest in cars led to him facing several car theft related charges in the years preceding the murder. He was also known to have a very violent temper. Les Murphy, aged 22, was the youngest, and he was known as having the worst temperament. He had faced the children's court on many occasions for a number of theft-related offences before being accused of the Cobby murder. Their trial began in Sydney on the 16th of March 1987. Travers changed his plea to guilty. The Sydney newspaper The Sun published a front page story the day the trial began, carrying the headline "Anita murdered man guilty," alongside a large image of Travers. The story referred to Michael Murphy as an unemployed prisoner escapee of no fixed address, and another in the same paper detailed Murphy's criminal convictions and his recent escape from Silverwater Correctional Centre while he was serving a 25-year sentence for a string of burglaries and theft. The jury was discharged due to the potentially prejudicial information published about Murphy. According to medical examiner's report, Cobby's body showed extensive bruising on her head, breast, face, shoulders, groin, thighs and legs consistent with asymmetric beating. It also included a blow of considerable force around the right eye. She also had lacerations on her hips, thighs and legs from barbed wire, several cuts to her neck resulting in a severing of the ear and her windpipe and near decapitation, and many cuts on her hands and fingers, resulting in nearly severing all 3 of her fingers. This likely occurred while she raised her hands to her face, trying to protect herself from the knife. The trial for the remaining members of the gang lasted 54 days, with the men's defence relying on convincing the jury of their minimal involvement in the beating and murder. On the 10th of June 1987, all 5 were found guilty of sexual assault and murder. On the 16th of June, they were sentenced to the Supreme Court of New South Wales to life imprisonment, plus the additional time without the possibility of parole. The next hometown murder we're looking at is William McDonald. He was an English serial killer responsible for the death of 5 people in the Australian states of Queensland and New South Wales between 1961 and 1962. He was born in Liverpool, England in 1924. Between 1961 and 62, McDonald terrorised Sydney with a string of gruesome murders after being apprehended while working as a porter at Melbourne's Spencer Street railway station on the 13th of May 1963. His modus operandi was to select his male victims at random, mostly derelicts, lure them into a dark place, violently punch and stab them with a long-bladed knife dozens of times about the head and neck, and then finally sever their genitals. Due to his gruesome style of murdering victims, he was given the nickname the Mutilator by the media. MacDonald was born Allen Ginsberg in Liverpool, England in 1924. In 1943, at the age of 19, MacDonald was enlisted in the army and transferred to the Lancashire Fusiliers. One night, MacDonald was raped in an air raid shelter by one of his corporals. The experience traumatised him, and the thought preyed on his mind for the rest of his life. Discharged from the army in 1947, he was diagnosed as having schizophrenia and committed for several months to a mental asylum where he daily was treated with electroconvulsive therapy. MacDonald changed his name, then emigrated from England to Canada in 1949. He then went to Australia in 1955. Shortly after his arrival, he was arrested and charged for touching a detective's penis in a public toilet in Adelaide. For this, he was placed on a 2-year good behaviour bond. After moving to Ballarat, MacDonald then moved to Sydney in 1961 as a construction worker. He found accommodation in East Sydney, where he became known in the parks and public toilets that were surreptitiously meeting places for homosexual men due to the criminalisation of the same-sex sexual activity. The murders began in Brisbane in 1961. MacDonald befriended a 63-year-old man named Amos Hugh Hurst outside the Roma Street railway station. After a long drinking session at one of the local pubs, they went back to Hurst's apartment where they consumed more alcohol. When Hurst became intoxicated, MacDonald began to strangle him. Hurst was so intoxicated that he did not realise what was happening and eventually began to hemorrhage. Blood poured from his mouth and onto MacDonald's hands. MacDonald then punched Hurst in the face, killing him. MacDonald then placed Hurst onto his bed, took off his trousers and shoes and pulled the sheets up over Hurst's head and tucked them in around all sides. MacDonald then waited there a while, then turned off the lights and left the apartment. 5 days later, he found Hurst's name in a newspaper obituary column. It said Hurst had died accidentally. MacDonald's surprise had been in terror of the police arresting him for the murder, even though he was certain that no one had seen him leave Hurst's room. On the 4th of June 1961, police were summoned to a Sydney Domain baths. A man's nude corpse had been found, savagely stabbed over 30 times, with the genitalia completely severed from his body. Alfred Reginald Greenfield became the second victim, claimed by the killer, soon to be dubbed the Mutilator. Greenfield 41 had been sitting on a park bench in Green Park, just across the road from St Vincent's Hospital in Darlinghurst. McDonald offered Greenfield a drink and lured him to a nearby Domain baths on the pretext of providing more alcohol. McDonald waited until Greenfield fell asleep, then removed his knife from its sheath and stabbed him approximately 30 times. The ferocity of the first blow severed the arteries in Greenfield's neck. McDonald then pulled down Greenfield's trousers and underwear, severed his genitals, put them in a plastic bag and threw them in Sydney Harbour. Similar to the second victim, Ernest William Cobby, a 47-year-old male, possibly around the age of 36 to 37 years old, was stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. His body was found in a public toilet at Moore Park. On this night, McDonald was walking down to South Dowling Street where he met Cobby. McDonald lured his victim to Moore Street Park and drank beer with him in a public toilet. Just before the attack, McDonald put his plastic raincoat. Cobby was sitting on the toilet seat when McDonald, using an uppercut motion, struck Cobby in the neck with the knife, severing his jugular vein. Blood spattered all over McDonald's arms, face and his plastic raincoat. Cobby tried to defend himself by raising his arms. McDonald continued to stab his victim multiple times, covering the toilet cubicle with blood. McDonald then severed the victim's genitals, placed them in a plastic bag along with his knife and departed the scene. On the way home, McDonald washed the blood off his hands and face. On the 31st of March 1962, in the suburb of Darlinghurst, New South Wales, the mortally wounded Frank Gladstone McLean was found by a man walking with his wife and young child. He was the victim of an unfinished assault committed by McDonald. The man found McLean still breathing but bleeding heavily and went to get police. On this day, McDonald bought a knife from a sports store in Sydney. That night, McDonald left the Oxford Hotel in Darlinghurst and followed McLean down Burke Street past the local station. McDonald initiated a conversation with McLean and suggested they have a drinking session around the corner in Burke Lane. As they entered the lane, McDonald plunged his knife into McLean's throat. McLean tried to fight off the attack but was too intoxicated to do so. He then stabbed again in the face and punched, forcing him off balance. The assault was interrupted by a young family approaching. McDonald hit himself on hearing the voices and the sound of a baby's cry. Once the man and his family had left, McDonald returned to the barely alive McLean, pulled him further into the lane and stabbed him again. A total of 6 stab wounds were inflicted. He then pulled down his trousers, sliced off his genitals and put them in a plastic bag, which he took home and disposed of the next day. The police at one stage thought the killer had been a deranged surgeon. The manner in which McLean's genitals were removed seemed to be done by someone with years of surgical experience. Doctors at this stage found themselves under investigation. After being dismissed from his job at the local post office, where he had been hired as a letter sorter under the assumed name of Alan Edward Brennan, McDonald went into business for himself. He purchased a mixed business store on Burwood Road in Concord, again under the assumed name of Brennan. Here he intended to sell sandwiches and small goods, living in rooms above the store. He only lived there for about a week after paying the purchase deposit. On the night of Saturday the 6th of June 1962, McDonald went to a wine saloon in Pitt Street, Sydney. He met 37-year-old Patrick Joseph Hackett, a thief and derelict who had recently been released from prison. He went back to McDonald's new residence where they continued to drink alcohol. After a short period, Hackett fell asleep on the floor. McDonald then got out a boning knife that he used in his delectation. He stabbed Hackett in the neck and the blow passing straight through. At first blow, Hackett woke up and tried to shield himself, pushing the knife back into McDonald's other hand and severely severing it. McDonald then unleashed a renewed attack, eventually striking the knife into Hackett's heart, killing him instantly. He continued to stab his victim until he'd stopped breathing. Hackett's blood was splattered all over the walls and floor. The knife having become blunted, McDonald was unable to sever his victim's genitals and fell asleep. When he awoke the next morning, he found himself lying next to the victim's body, covered in sticky, dry blood. Pools of blood had soaked through the floorboards and was almost onto the counter in his shop downstairs. He cleaned himself and went to hospital to have a wound in his hand stitched. He told his doctor that he'd cut his hand in the shop. After cleaning up the blood, McDonald dragged Hackett's corpse underneath his shop. Believing the police had come looking for his victim, he fled. 3 weeks later in Brisbane, neighbours noticed a putrid smell coming through the shop and called the health department, which in turn called the police. On the 20th of November 1962, police discovered the rotten corpse, which was too badly decomposed to be identified. An autopsy determined the body was of someone in their 40s, which tallied up to records of the mission shop owner, Brennan. In late July, the police were still made no connection between the cases and the 3 previous mutilated killings, and had profiled the killers operating in Sydney's inner eastern suburbs, which were many miles distant from Conrad. After investigations, the victim was incorrectly identified as Brennan or McDonald, and a notice was published in a newspaper obituary column. This was read by his former workmates at the local post office, who attended a small memorial service conducted by a local funeral director. McDonald, living in Brisbane, then moved to New Zealand, believing the police were still looking for him. He felt the need to kill again, but for some reason returned to Sydney to do so. Returning to Sydney, he met former workmate John McCarthy, who said, "I believe you had died," at which McDonald replied, "Leave me alone," and ran away, travelling to Melbourne soon afterwards. McCarthy went straight to the police. At first they did not believe him, accused him of having too much to drink, and was told to go home and sleep it off. They even said he was crazy. He went back again the next day and tried to explain that it had happened, but they still didn't believe him. McCarthy went to the Daily Mirror newspaper, where he spoke to the crime reporter Joe Morris. McCarthy explained how he bumped into the supposed to be dead Brennan. The reporter saw the account as credible and filed a story under the headline "Case of the Walking Corpse." Publication forced the police to exhume the corpse. Fingerprints identified the body as belonging to Hackett and not McDonald. Closer examination found the body had several stab wounds and mutilation of the penis and testicles, potentially linking the crime to the notorious mutilator. Police obtained an identikit picture of McDonald, and it was circulated every newspaper in the nation. McDonald had taken a job on Melbourne Railways and being hired as David Allen. He tried to disguise himself, but he was instantly recognised by his co-workers. Melbourne police arrested him, and he collected his pay for that week. McDonald admitted to the killing, blaming them on an insatiable urge to kill. He claimed he was the victim of rape as a teenager, and it had disempowered the victims by mutilating their genitals, but he'd chosen them at random. He also said he heard voices telling him to do it, and that it were of the corporal who raped him as a teenager. He was charged with 4 counts of murder and committed to a trial on the 15th of August 1963. The trial began in September and was one of the nation's sensational. But he pleaded not guilty on the grounds of insanity, and he testified in great detail to the gruesome murders. The jury chose to ignore overwhelming evidence for insanity in handing down a guilty verdict, which amazed expert psychiatrists. Before passing sentence, Justin McLean said that it was the most barbaric case of the murder and total disregard for human life he'd come across in many years on the bench. McDonald showed no signs of remorse and made it quite clear that he was free. He would go on killing. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences with a strong recommendation he'd never been released. And the last hometown murders case we're looking at is the Wanda Beach murders. It's the case of the unsolved murders of Marianne Smith and Christine Sharrock at Wanda Beach near Cronulla in Sydney, Australia on the 11th of January 1965. Both victims were 15, were best friends and neighbours from the suburb of West Ryde, and their partially buried bodies was discovered the next day. The brutal nature of the slayers and the fact that it occurred on a deserted, windswept beach brought massive publicity to the case. By April 1966, police had interviewed over 7,000 people, making it the largest investigation in American history. It remains one of the most infamous unsolved Australian murder cases in the 1960s and New South Wales' oldest unsolved homicide case. Marianne Smith had arrived in Melbourne with her family from West Germany in September 1958. At the time, the family consisted of parents Helmut and Elizabeth and their siblings Helmut Jr., Hans, Peter, Trixie and Wolfgang. Another child, Norbert, was born the following year. After arriving in Australia, the Smith family lived in a migrant house hostel in Uradera, New South Wales, before settling in Temora. In 1963, Helmut Smith moved the family to Sydney after contracting Hodgkinson's disease, and they found a home in West Ryde. In June the next year, Mr. Smith died. Smith's next door neighbour was Christine Sharrock, who lived with her grandparents Jim and Jeanette Tague. Sharrock's father died in 1953 and her mother Beryl remarried and was living in northwestern Sydney suburb of Seven Hills. Sharrock moved in with her grandparents by choice, and when the Smiths arrived next door, she developed a strong relationship with Marianne, who was the same age. It would be never revealed as why Sharrock decided it was best for her to live with her grandparents and not her mother and stepfather. On the 1st of January 1965, Sharrock and Smith visited the beach at Cronulla and had been a popular picnic spot for the Smith family. Diary entries read after the murders indicated that the girls had kissed some boys at the beach this day. The following day, the Smith children visited the beach, there again without Sharrock. Meanwhile, Mrs. Smith, who'd been admitted to a hospital for a major operation, leaving Helmut Jr. and Marianne in charge of the household. On Saturday the 9th of January, Smith and Sharrock asked Mrs. Smith, who was still hospitalised, if they could take the younger children to Cronulla the next day, and was given permission. However, rain prevented the trip. On Monday the 11th of January, accompanied by Smith's 4 youngest siblings, the girls set off by train for Cronulla railway station after transferring at Redfern. They arrived about 11 a.m, but it was very windy and the beach was closed. The group then walked to the southern end of the beach, sheltered among the rocks. 8-year-old Wolfgang still wanted to swim, so Smith went with him to a shallow part of the surf away from the rocks. They returned to the group. They had a picnic. At some point during this time, Sharrock left the others and went off by herself. When she returned, they decided to walk into the sandhills behind Wanda Beach. At 1 p.m, the group had reached a point around 400 metres beyond the Wanda Surf Club and then stopped to take shelter behind a sandhill as the young children were complaining about the conditions. Smith told her young siblings that she and Sharrock would return to the rocky area at the southern end of the beach where they hidden their bags, then return to fetch the children and head home. Instead, however, the girls continued into the sandhills. When Peter told them they was going the wrong way, they laughed at him and walked on. The Smith children remained waiting behind the sandhill until 5 p.m, at which time they returned to collect their bags, including Sharrock and Smith's purses, and went home on the last train, arriving home around 8 p.m. The girls were reported missing by 8:30 by Sharrock's grandmother. The next morning, on Tuesday the 12th of January, Peter Smith was taking 3 young nephews for a walk around the Wanda Beach sandhill. Some distance north of the surf club, he discovered what appeared to be a store mannequin buried face down in the sand. He brushed away the sand from the head and realised it was a body. Police were called from the nearby surf club. At this point, Smith believed he had found only one young woman. When the scene was examined, Smith was found lying on her side, her left leg bent. Sherrick was face down, her head against the sole of Sherrick Smith's left foot. Both had scratch marks on their faces. From a 34-metre long drag mark leading to the scene, police determined that Sherrick had fled, possibly while Smith was dying, only to be caught, incapacitated and dragged back to the body of her friend. An intensive search was undertaken to find the murder weapons, a long knife and some sort of blunt instrument, but they were never found. Tons of sand from around the murder scene was sifted through and various items were found, including a blood-stained blade, but police were unable to link it to the murders. The autopsy for Sherrick found a BAC of 0.0015, but alcohol was not found in Smith's autopsy. It was discovered that Sherrick had consumed food, possibly cabbage and celery, possibly a Chico roll. This was different from the rest of the party. It was suspected that occurred while she was alone. Sherrick's skull has been fractured by a blow to the back of the head and had been stabbed 14 times. Smith's throat had been deeply slashed and she had been stabbed 6 times. Their underwear had been cut and attempts had been made to rape both girls. Semen was found on both girls, but the autopsy showed that their hymens were intact. Smith's brother Hans had viewed photos of her body and said, quote, she had been stabbed 25 to 30 times. She almost been decapitated because her throat had been cut so viciously, end quote. It was also during Sherrick's absence that Wolfgang noticed a teenage boy hunting crabs. Later he claimed to have seen the same boy twice more, once in the company of his sister and Sherrick, and again sometime much later walking alone. There has been doubts about the description of this person, as Wolfgang's testimony over time variously suggested that he had made homemade a spear gun, a fishing knife or both. The last official sighting of Smith and Sherrick were around 12:45 by local fireman Dennis Dostine, who was walking alone with his son and saw the girls walking 730 metres north of the surf club. He told the police that he had seen them hurrying. One of the girls often looked behind as if they were being followed. He did not see anything else. There had been a number of people seen in the area who had never been identified and never came forward. Suspects of the crime: Sec Johnson, a former detective who had been investigating murders, was given a painting in 1975 by Alan Bassett. Bassett had been jailed for murdering Caroline Orphan, a 19-year-old woman in June 1966. He was attacked, raped and strangled, then her skull crushed with a rock. Sent to prison for life, he served 29 years before being released in 1995. The painting, titled A Bloody Awful Thing, showed an abstract landscape. Johnson believed the painting showed blood trails, a broken knife blade and the body of a victim, and became convinced that Bassett was the Wanda Beach killer. Johnson also became convinced that he showed a scene from the murders that only the killer would have known, as well as clues out as also the unsolved murders of Kruger and Dolinkler. Despite the skepticism of the other detectives, Johnson wrote a book about the case. Before it was published, he was killed in an accident. Other detectives, while retaining professional respect for Johnson, concluded he'd been wrong in his belief. One person Johnson convinced, however, was the Daily Mirror crime reporter Bill Jenkins. Jenkins repeated Johnson's claims in his ghostwritten memoirs, A Crime Goes By, devoting a whole chapter to the Wanda Beach murders. Most of the chapter was essentially a repeat of what had been written in his earlier book, Crime Reporter, but he mentioned Johnson, Bassett and the painting as well. A second suspect, Christopher Wilder, 2 years prior to the Wanda Beach murders, he was convicted of a gang rape on a Sydney beach, which led police to him conclude he was a suspect. He emigrated to the United States in 1969 and he embarked on a series of serial killings in the early 1980s. While visiting his parents in Australia in 1982, Wilder was charged with sexual offences against 2 15-year-old girls who he'd forced to pose nude. Wilder fled back to the US. In the first half of 1984, he committed 8 murders and attempted several more. He accidentally killed himself during a struggle with police in New Hampshire on the 13th of April 1984. A third suspect, not well publicised until 1988, is Derek Percy. He'd been in prison since 1969 for the murder of a child on a beach in Victoria. Percy was considered too dangerous to be released and is a prime suspect for a number of other murders of children in Melbourne and Sydney, and died in 2013 from cancer. He was considered a lead suspect for the Wanda Beach murders by the police. Percy was linked to the location on the date of the murders, but there were no other links found. It was hoped he would make a confession on his deathbed, but this never came. Thank you for everybody who's listened to this episode. This episode has been researched, written and hosted by me, Andrew Knight. Sound, music and editing has been provided by Harry Edmondson. Make sure you subscribe to the show anywhere where you listen to your podcast. This allows the episode to be downloaded automatically as soon as it's released. Please reach out to us on the social media. We're at Hometown Murders on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. Please support the show by leaving a 5-star rating or a review. It really does help.